Good morning, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second day of CJP's Global Jewish Summit. My name is Ariel Libhaber, and I'm the director of the Boston-Haifa Connection within Israel and Global Jewish Citizenship. I've been with CJP for almost 13 years. I have had the privilege to work closely with countless inspiring volunteers and talented professionals across all our agendas. I have seen numerous ideas grow into large-scale programs and partnerships develop beyond our wildest dreams, creating lasting impact in our communities and beyond. Parents at the Center of Ima Merkaz, which opened its doors 10 years ago in Haifa, was developed specifically to address real needs on the ground for parents and families of young children in struggling neighborhoods. Today, Parents at the Center is a national model for other cities across Israel, impacting diverse populations and setting the standards for parental engagement in early childhood. Our work with the Ethiopian Israeli community of Haifa continues to evolve in the areas of education, employment, health, and army service, while proving to be an example to others for efficient partnership, integration, and multiculturalism. Our young adults started as a small group of concerned citizens who wanted to see the cities of Haifa and Boston become vibrant communities for their fellow young adults. It is incredibly rewarding to see them today as true leaders in their fields, investing and encouraging the growth of a blossoming ecosystem across a variety of areas like social entrepreneurship, culture, women's leadership, and Jewish life. Today, we see the fruits of decades of investment in experiential Jewish education that brought together thousands of students and educators in our schools. Over 30 exciting relationship-building journeys between Israelis and American Jews at our schools and synagogue partnerships continue to thrive today. A model that has served as a catalyst for nothing short of a Jewish revolution in Haifa. We have also seen the tremendous impact of bringing the best young Israeli ambassadors over the years to the Boston area in the form of IDF officers and Shinshinim. These talented young Israelis were able to engage in meaningful ways with thousands of community members, sharing their personal stories, highlighting the diversity of Israeli society and the pride of serving the Jewish people. In an ever-divisive world, the Boston-Haifa connection is a proven answer that we are stronger together than apart, a true testament for people-to-people relationships, long-term investment, dreaming big, and implementing together creative solutions to real problems. And all of this is possible through collective effort that relies on strong partners and our incredibly dedicated volunteers and professionals on both sides of the ocean. In today's program, we're focusing on our response to the global pandemic. We are fortunate to be joined today by a number of community leaders. The new CEO of the Joint Distribution Committee, Ariel Zwang, Moderna's Chief Medical Officer and Haifa native, Dr. Talzaks, our Deputy Consul General of Israel to New England, Daniel Agranov, and Dr. Manford Green, Professor of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health at the University of Haifa, former head of the Public Health Branch of the IDF, and founding director of the Israel Center for Disease Control. Before we hear from them, we want to share a few of the ways that we have adapted and stepped up to address the needs of our communities. For so many of us, it has been a surreal and challenging year, and we have had to rethink how we work and connect with one another. A year ago, when the pandemic began, Israel and global Jewish citizenship pivoted quickly to find ways to retain the bonds of connection between our communities. We began hosting Friday Kabbalat Shabbat gatherings to stay connected. These now take place on the first Friday of each month. Our volunteers launched the Boston Haifa Cafe to create a forum for us to learn and be together each Tuesday. Our schools and synagogues pivoted to creating shared online experiences. Our Boston and Haifa young adults have partnered to develop a series of workshops that address their needs. And of course, we stepped up to provide much needed critical assistance to the most vulnerable members in our communities in Haifa and Dnipro. To date, CJP has allocated over $2.3 million in emergency support, both here in Boston and overseas. Here is a short video that offers a glimpse into how we stepped up to support our partners in their time of need.
Over the past year, CJP has provided food, access to technology, and vital services to the most vulnerable, locally in Israel and around the world.
When the COVID started, the corona, we were in big panic because we knew that we don't have a strong medical system to take care of the people.
In the Ukrainian city of Dnipro, CJP allocated emergency funds to provide urgently needed medical supplies and equipment. We assisted the Dnipro Jewish Medical Center to establish an 80-bed field hospital for COVID-19 patients and set up a COVID-19 hotline staffed by 6 doctors to provide advice and information to all of Ukraine. Through our partnership with Action for Post-Soviet Jewry, we sent food, medicine, and soap to elderly Jews in and around Dnipro.
The first ones to call us and ask, how can we help you? Were you guys, the people in the CJP, the first funds to help us immediately to buy medicine, to buy equipment, to buy masks, to buy everything we needed to help people came from you. I wanted to tell a big thank you to all my brothers and sisters in Boston. You are the best and you are very kind, and I want God to give you a healthy and happy life.
In Haifa, CJP offered financial and technical assistance to Ethiopian businesses and entrepreneurs to better streamline their work and maximize revenue during these difficult times. We provided scholarships to more than 90 Ethiopian college students who had lost their jobs. And in the community, Parents at the Center, the facility that supports Haifa families from at-risk populations, has provided virtual parental guidance, workshops, and activities to 370 families.
רצינו להגיד תודה מכל המשפחה שלנו על העזרה בזמן הלא פשוט הזה. המון המון תודה.
תודה רבה לכם מאוד מאוד, ובגלל שעזרת לנו, ובאמת, thank you very very much. תודה רבה לכם.
CJP has also purchased and distributed more than 100 computers to enable remote learning for children that needed access to online instruction.
הייתי בקבוצת אחריי של תוכנית נתיבים של שותפות חיפה בוסטון. בעצם אני עליתי לארץ ישראל בסוף 2008 בחנוכה, כשהמשבר הקורונה התחיל. צצו המון קשיים, מבחינה לימודית וגם בזמן הבגרויות. לא יכולתי ללמוד, לא יכולתי להשלים את הפער מהבית. באותה תקופה הציעו לי מחשב נייד, כדי שאני אוכל לשפר את הבגרויות בצורה הטובה ביותר. ובהחלט זה עזר. וגם כיום המחשב משמש אותי במכינה, בחיים, באופן כללי. אז קודם כל אני רוצה להגיד Thank you very much for CJP, שותפות חיפה בוסטון. It was amazing to be in אחריי.
Hi, I'm Ariel Zwang. I'm proud to be JDC's new CEO and so grateful for the opportunity to virtually be here with you today. I love Boston. I lived there for 6 years as a student, and it has been such a pleasure to get to know Mark Baker and talk about our shared work. Through our partnership with CJP, JDC continues to save Jewish lives and build Jewish life in 70 countries around the world. We've adapted our operations to respond to the crisis and new reality. What that means is that together, we haven't skipped a beat, even in this challenging time of pandemic and loss. For example, we served without interruption more than 80,000 of the world's poorest Jews in the former Soviet Union, ensuring life-saving home care, food, and medicine for vulnerable elderly. I know you in Boston have a special connection with the wonderful Jewish community of Dnipro, Ukraine. And so I wanted to share a quick story from one senior there, Oktyabrina, an 87-year-old retired seamstress who now struggles to survive on a meager pension of just a few dollars a day. Oktyabrina is also a diabetic, and she lives alone, and she depends on JDC and CJP for food, medicine, home care, and medical equipment. She says, on my pension, I'd never be able to survive without this help. But now, thanks to you, I have food in my refrigerator. I have everything I need. I could cry. That's the kind of impact that we make possible together. And Oktyabrina's story is just one among tens of thousands. Because of your partnership in Israel, we're helping the vulnerable and unemployed get through isolation and economic strife. We've moved Jewish life online from Budapest to Mumbai to ensure that it continues and draws new and widening audiences. And we're helping the new poor across Europe, Latin America, and North Africa to weather the unprecedented financial difficulties of this pandemic, ensuring that families can pay their rent and put food on the table. We at JDC are so grateful to be your partners. Together, we're ensuring that even in these isolating times, Jews around the world are never alone. Thank you for your friendship and your support.
My name is Talzaks. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Moderna Therapeutics. And I was born and raised in Haifa. I actually started my love affair with science and medicine back in the city of Haifa. I grew up in the Ariel. And my father was one of the founding members of the math department there. Having access to the Technion, the Haifa University, Rambam, volunteering as a medic back when I was in high school, really started my path towards this dual passion. And later in life, we came to the States. I studied medicine in Israel, but completed my training in the United States. And I've spent my career really translating science into medicine. That journey has brought me to a company called Moderna back in 2015, before we ever had anything in the clinic. But the opportunity to translate the fundamental information of life as encoded in messenger RNA into teaching our body to make medicine on its own, in this case a vaccine, was really an intellectual attraction I couldn't resist. And the impact that I foresaw possible was really what led me to this job. In the beginning of last year, in the beginning of 2020, we were positioned in a collaboration with the NIH, having tested our platform in early stage trials to see the utility in vaccines. And that strong collaboration has enabled us to leverage our technology within less than a year to fully develop a vaccine based on the messenger RNA technology to prevent COVID-19. We did that through a collaboration with numerous government entities, the NIH on one hand, regulated by FDA, working closely and supported by the US government, by BARDA, but with a keen global interest as well. And it's not a mistake that the state of Israel has secured access to the 2 messenger RNA vaccines for its citizens pretty much at the front of the line. The vaccine, as many of you are aware, has been proven to be effective, both ours and Pfizer's, to a very high degree of efficacy in preventing particularly severe COVID-19 disease. And so I think these vaccines and others coming behind them are going to shortly serve as the cornerstone for turning this pandemic around. It is a wonderful example of science translating into medicine, and that medicine translating into a huge impact on all of us. And while this pandemic continues to evolve and we're seeing some variants emerge, and it may be with us for a while, I strongly believe that the efficacy of this and other vaccines to prevent severe disease will be upheld. And in the coming years, we will see society return to normal, perhaps to a certain extent redefine what normal is, but certainly as it relates to the degree of morbidity and mortality we've seen in our communities, I expect that tide to recede and for life to come back to normal. Thank you.
Unfortunately, Consul General Ruben is not able to be with us today. However, we are thrilled that Daniel Agranov, Deputy Consul General of Israel to New England, is joining us this morning. Welcome, Deputy Consul General Agranov.
Thank you, Ariel. Shalom and Boker Tov, everyone, or Tzoraim Tovim if you're from Israel. I am excited that the Consulate General of Israel to New England taking part in annual March meeting, which I understand have been a staple of the strong and unique partnership cultivated by the Jews of Boston and their Haifa counterpart for decades. Nothing can replace people-to-people relationship as the foundation for strengthening the ties between the diaspora and Israel. You are the shining example of this model of purposeful human connection and Jewish peoplehood. I am pleased to briefly share with you my perspective about Israeli response to the coronavirus crisis. From the outset of the pandemic, Israel emerged as a leading nation in the global fight against the deadly outbreak. We made tough decisions early on, closing borders and schools, shuttering businesses, and limiting all non-essential activities. Moreover, Israel produced a burst of innovation in response to the pandemic, including COVID-centric startups in addition to drive-through testing centers, telemedicine, and vaccine research. If you're following the Israeli news, you know that not everything is going smoothly. But Israel now boasts the highest per capita vaccination rate of any country globally, outpassing all others by far. Israel began its vaccination drive in late December, and as of now, more than 8 million vaccinations have occurred, with 2/3 of our adults having been vaccinated. This speedy and ambitious program have been made possible in part by a deal Israel linked with pharmaceutical companies early on in the pandemic. Indeed, I am so thrilled that Dr. Talzaks had addressed you already, since our consulate was instrumental in facilitating the Moderna deal with Israel. We are receiving ongoing shipment of both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, which we hope will enable us to become one of the first countries in the world to exit from the pandemic crisis, which has brought so much hardship from a public health and economic perspective. By sharing our statistical data with the world, Israel is playing a key role in demonstrating the vaccine efficacy and its developing global strategy to overcome the pandemic. Just an example from this week, Italy is using Israeli data that show the efficacy of the first shot and deciding to try and give as many first shots as possible to the population while delaying the second shot. Israeli universal healthcare system is globally recognized for its efficiency and effectiveness. We develop a sophisticated and high quality patient care level with guaranteed healthcare for all Israeli citizens and permanent residents, regardless of their ethnic background. There are thousands of clinics spread across the country, ensuring that every local community is served. The comprehensive system of doctors, nurses, and medics rapidly mobilized in response to the pandemic and is now working toward vaccinating the entire country within a matter of months. Israel's experience with existential threats mean that we are exceptionally well placed to handle an emergency of the magnitude that COVID-19 brought on. Both Magen David Adom and the Israeli Defense Force have been mobilized to aid in the current vaccination push. With these extraordinary efforts, Israel hopes that at this year's Seder, all of the generation will be able to gather around the table together once again celebrate more than the exodus from Egypt, but also the emancipation from the plague of COVID-19. Toda rabah and good health to all of you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us this morning and for all that you and the Consul General are doing to help the State of Israel and to strengthen the relationship between Boston and Israel. We're so fortunate to have you. My name is Lisa Wallack. I am proud to serve as co-chair of the Israel and Global Jewish Citizenship Committee and to be here today. I'm also a past co-chair of the Boston-Haifa Connection. And I'm thrilled to be here today to interview and to bring to this great audience Dr. Green. Dr. Manford Green is the director of University of Haifa's International Masters in Public Health Program. He's past head of the Public Health Branch for the IDF, and he's the founding director of the Israel Center for Disease Control. He currently serves on an advisory panel of professionals that is helping the government of Israel to navigate the COVID crisis. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Green, and welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Shalom.
Israel's vaccination campaign has been an example to much of the world, as Daniel just shared. And we'd love to hear from you what you think really accounts for the success of the vaccination campaign.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you to the CJP for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I think that already you've heard from Daniel, the Deputy Consul General, more or less the logistics of it. But in addition to the fact that we really have, in that sense, a very well-organized health system where it's relatively easy to vaccinate the population because everybody belongs to one of the health funds and is insured. So that act makes it much more accessible. But I think there was one point that needs to be remembered. The professional committees recommended to the government to start basically take options on vaccines very early. And while that sounds almost obvious now, as Yogi Bear would say, it's hard to predict the future. It's much easier to predict the past. So it's easy to predict what we should have done. In 2009, we, together with many other countries, we actually acquired huge amounts of Tamiflu for an expected pandemic of flu, of influenza, and as a result, it turns out there wasn't much of a pandemic. So there was a lot of criticism for the wasted expense of acquiring medication. So you take a risk. You basically say, we don't know what's going to happen, but we prepare for the worst, and we take the criticism for the possible, unnecessary expenditure. In this case, it worked out very well.
So in addition to being proactive and thinking ahead of much of the world, Israel has also taken a very aggressive stance with regard to containment measures, including lockdowns and restrictions and even closing the airport. Can you share a little bit about how this has impacted the country in terms of the battle against the virus, and also a bit about how it's impacted you personally?
Well, it's you pay a price for these things. It's not a simple decision, and there could be those, and those who would say that our restrictions were too restrictive. And in fact, it's had an impact both on the kids who are not at school, which has been very dramatic, and this is something that we'll have to try and make up. The huge number of businesses that were impacted. So many people in many respects have suffered from these restrictions, although these restrictions did in fact reduce dramatically the disease and the spread of the disease. So I guess, again, for epidemiologists particularly, and working with economists, basically, you look at this kind of cost effectiveness and you say, well, what is the cost? What cost are we prepared to pay? I think that when we do evaluate it in the future, there may be some who will say that the price was a little too high, that we maybe should have been a little less restrictive. But again, it's like looking back is much easier than looking forward. You wanted to comment on something personally? Personally, my wife works for the World Health Organization in Copenhagen. And we usually fly backwards and forwards. She's head of the World Emergency Preparedness in the World Health Organization in Europe. And we usually fly backwards and forwards to meet, to spend some time there and there. So we haven't been together now for more than 3 months. So we haven't been able to get out or get here. So that's been a little difficult, but it's a very small price to pay for, compared with what others have paid for the kind of sacrifices they've made.
Well, we appreciate it. Must be very challenging, and so many of us are so eager to get to Israel and to rejoin family and friends, but to be separated from your wife for that long is obviously quite a toll, and our thoughts are with you. The general population in Israel has been vaccinated. I think Daniel mentioned more than a higher percentage than in any country. I'd love for you to elaborate on that, and also to share a little bit about how the population initially reacted to the vaccinations and how people are feeling today.
Okay. We've been doing well, but early on, we did a study in October, which we've just published recently, showing that before the vaccine became available, the population was to a large extent very suspicious of the vaccine. There was a relatively a small percentage who said that they would immediately accept the vaccine. You know, the usual thing saying, let somebody else get it first and then I'll get it, which is kind of sounds interesting. Who is that other person supposed to be? Your neighbor or someone or a friend? So basically, there was suspicion. A vaccine that's produced very quickly, the name of a vaccine that has the mRNA, which is a sort of genetic material, although it doesn't affect your genetics, but this obviously made people a little concerned. So we did have some resistance. As it turned out, the resistance was less than we expected, but we still do have, shall we say, the hardcore who are resisting, and there are still some groups who are producing a lot of misinformation. So we're going to have to work very hard on that hardcore. We won't get to herd immunity until we really get to that hardcore and persuade them that this is a safe and effective vaccine, and this is the only way we'll deal with this pandemic.
So there are also much lower vaccination rates within the ultra-Orthodox and the Israeli Arab populations. Can you speak a little bit as to why that may be and what can be done about it?
You know, I think there are a couple. In general, we could say that there's not anti-vaccination sentiment either in the ultra-Orthodox or in the Arab, despite a lot of so-called rumors to the contrary. In fact, the Arab population, in the children in the Arab population, are more highly vaccinated than in the Jewish population. They have very high vaccination rates because these are acceptable vaccines and routine. And the Orthodox community, most of the reasons why occasionally there's not enough vaccination coverage is because of logistic reasons, large families and difficulties to access and so on. And these are things that have to be dealt with. I think now we have to counter a lot of information, misinformation, and I'll just mention one or two, which you're obviously familiar with. But for example, the misinformation that it could somehow impact on fertility of women is actually an old concept that was used basically to interfere with vaccination programs in Nigeria, for example, where there was this misinformation that the West was producing vaccines to control basically fertility in Nigeria, and that this was through the vaccines. And as a result, there was a reduction in the vaccination against polio, and we had problems with polio there. So this spreads very easily. It has no basis scientifically. It's pure misinformation, but it's very difficult to counteract.
We've also seen in the media some accusations that Israel isn't doing enough to provide the Palestinians with vaccinations. Can you please share your thoughts on this?
Okay, that always sounds like a kind of a political question, but in fact, I'm an epidemiologist. I'm not a politician. I'm a medical epidemiologist. As an epidemiologist, Israel and the Palestinian Authority are one area, pretty much one population. The virus doesn't distinguish between us. We're part of a global family, but particularly where we are, where there's this intermixing of populations, there's no doubt that we have to make sure that the Palestinians are vaccinated. We will not control the pandemic in Israel if the Palestinians are not vaccinated. And this is, we're very fortunate. I think we've spoken about this openly in the committees. This is our recommendation as professionals. And the Israeli government has now agreed to vaccinate all Palestinian workers who are coming into Israel. I really hope now that we can join hands with the Palestinians and help them also to get their population vaccinated.
Can you share a little bit about the Green Passport program and how it's working, and if you think it's a model that could work here in the United States?
Yeah, I think the Green Passport has a couple of features. Excuse me. The Green Passport is very useful obviously for the individual, because it means that you are then able to participate in things that you won't be able to participate. Schools can open. Maybe that'll be a sensitive issue, but let's assume that there is some way of saying that the teachers should be encouraged to vaccinate and have green passports so that there isn't spread in the schools as for the kids. But the other very important aspect is giving incentives to people to be vaccinated. This sounds all strange. You may say, well, it's obvious to people, be vaccinated to protect yourself. But we're human beings, and we like to know that there's some advantage, in addition to this reduction in risk. And we have information now from some, and certainly even in the Arab population, I say even, I'm saying only even because there is a lower vaccination rate, where the green passport is very important. And in fact, one of the villages, I have an information that I work with, where there were about 1,000 people vaccinated in this village out of about 10,000, 8 to 10,000, or maybe. And after the green passport idea came out, it jumped to about 5,000. In other words, there was an immediate response that this was a good idea. So even with all the myths and all the misinformation, this green passport could be very good.
Excellent. Do you think that when do you think that Israel will reach herd immunity, and what else needs to happen in order to achieve that goal?
Okay, I mean, I could go in, you're talking to an epidemiologist who has an interest in these models and so on, say, you'll end up hearing me talk nonsense for hours on that, on what is herd immunity. So let's not drag me into that too much. But basically, the herd immunity has been simplified to a situation where it's not exactly what is spoken about in the public. It's, you say 70%, 80%. It's based on mathematical models of ideal situations and so on and so forth. So in fact, we use it as an approximation, but we do know, and by the way, we don't have a lot of experience for the so-called herd immunity. Where we do have it is for diseases like measles and mumps and so on, where the herd immunity has to be in the 90s, 95%, 96%, because those are very contagious diseases, particularly measles. So herd immunity for diseases where it's 70% and so on, or 80%, we don't have a lot of experience. But I would add one thing. We do have a kind of an unusual situation as well. The herd immunity, for example, that we do for some of the respiratory, for meningococcal disease or pneumococcal, those kind of diseases, or flu, they are spread from children very much to adults. And in COVID-19, it's not so much. So we knew then, particularly the Japanese who did this years ago, that if you actually vaccinate the children, you reduce dramatically the disease in the whole population, because you actually vaccinate the spreaders. With COVID-19, it doesn't really work like that. The children are actually spreading much less. We now believe they're spreading more than we thought, but they're spreading less. But at the end of the day, I mean, at the end of that rather long answer, we need to vaccinate the kids. There's not going to be herd immunity without vaccinating the kids. So even if we get to 80 or 90% in the adult population, we still have to vaccinate the kids. The virus is not just going to disappear.
So the goal, as I understand it, had been to get most Israelis inoculated by the end of March, so that families potentially could be together for Pesach. We're just under a month away from that now. Is that a realistic possibility in your opinion?
Yeah, I think if you look at it, we're still not going to be vaccinating the children, so that's an issue. So we're still going to have disease and we're going to have spread. But really, if you look at the spread, and if you think about how we live with influenza, if I was to tell you, that was a bad influenza season or a good one, you probably wouldn't get too excited about it because you didn't really feel it. It was not dramatically spoken about. In fact, I've spoken to people who lived through the 1957 and 68 pandemics of influenza, and they can't remember a big fuss being made about it. So, in fact, although there were a lot of deaths. So if we can reduce the mortality, if we can reduce the disease, which we are doing, it's dropping pretty dramatically in Israel. In the severe cases in the elderly population, elderly, over 50 now becomes elderly. For me, those are children. but we're dropping that mortality. There certainly is in the youngsters. But I think we should start trying to get back to a normal life. I mean, it's very important for the society. There's no doubt in my mind.
We're hearing a lot about the new coronavirus strains. Curious about what the impact of these new strains has been and what your thoughts are about whether the current vaccines will be adequate or if there will need to be revaccinations in the future.
Yeah, again, I'll go back to the issue of what are these new strains and why are they bothered? You know, again, if I go back to the discussions we have in our committees, for many years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, whatever, we've been talking about new strains of influenza all the time. Not just the regular drift, you know, changing the vaccine from one to the next, but you know, you certainly remember bird flu and swine flu and so on. And we've certainly had, shall we say, real threats to our society because we thought that some of the bird flu viruses would then transmit very effectively. All flu viruses are bird flu, but the new strains would actually transmit more effectively in people. And they were, in fact, we had some outbreaks in Asia and so on, and even in Egypt of 40, 50% mortality, in other words, but in small numbers, So we've always been living with this concept of new strains. So I think that what we'll do is adapt it to this one as well. We'll adjust the vaccines, add vaccine doses, and we'll get over it. I'm optimistic. You know, we can handle it. I know that sounds like bravado, but I think that's what we'll be doing.
We have some questions in our chat that I'd love to run by you. One is, if you've recovered from COVID, do you recommend still getting the vaccine, and how long should one wait? Okay.
I'll tell you what the recommendation is in Israel, and then I'll just add a comment. The recommendation, which is very new now, is that it should be given that people who have had COVID should still get the vaccine 3 to 6 months after they've recovered. It's actually a security, an extra security, because we don't have a lot of data. We do know that people who've had COVID can get it again, but they generally get a very mild form, and it's not very common. So we're still waiting to see what will happen. So basically we're saying if we have enough vaccine, and I emphasize that only in the situation where there's enough vaccine available, then you should be thinking about vaccinating again those 3 to 6 months later. It's an extra precaution. It's not really, in my opinion, it's still not really based on very hard data. But I'm part of the committee that decided, so I'm joined in that decision, that we do recommend an extra dose. But if that's, again, if you have enough vaccine.
We have some other great questions here. One is that someone had heard that the reason that Israel received so much vaccine early is that there was an arrangement to provide post-inoculation data on the effectiveness of the vaccines and to serve really as almost a clinical trial laboratory for learnings. And I would welcome your thoughts on whether you know that's true, or certainly what we have been able to learn from Israel's successful and early use of the vaccines.
Speaking up front, I do understand that there was an agreement with Pfizer that they would get access to data. According to the agreement, it would be data that would generally be made available to others. It wouldn't be only restricted to them. But I must be honest, we would have done that anyway. I mean, that's part of our job. And in fact, this is a very exciting opportunity for epidemiologists. And just to give you an example, there are at least 3 and probably more. I say 3, there are probably about 10 groups. Those are the ones that I know of who are working exactly on this, pretty much the same idea. How effective is the vaccine? So, and in fact, the first publication that's come out in the New England Journal of Medicine had nothing to do with the company, with Pfizer. It was done independently by Clalit. So, you know, if that was a condition of the agreement with Pfizer, Well, that was a very cheap condition because we would have done it for free.
Absolutely, and Israel is certainly serving as a light unto the nations with sharing all of the learnings that have come from the experience with the vaccination program, and it certainly is incredibly beneficial to so many of us around the world. Here's another interesting question about missions, sending so many of our communities on missions to countries all around the world, like India, Brazil, Mexico, Ukraine, and Morocco. There's a question about what indicators should we be using before we decide to reopen these missions, and how worried should we be about variants in traveling to countries like this?
You know, it's one of these questions where there's basically no guarantee. I would say as follows: you have to assess the country, and I'll put in an advertisement. You can actually consult with my wife at the World Health Organization. So basically, they'll tell you more or less the risk in each country. I would say particularly, firstly, be vaccinated. That's obvious. If you're vaccinated, there may be variants. I would say probably if it's a country where there is a lot of activity, a lot of virus, and we still don't quite know what's going on there, I would say that people who are older, and again, what is older, but let's say 60, 70, whatever, you can decide. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but the older people and people who have really real risk factors. I'm not just talking about a mild, a controlled hypertension or something. I'm talking about people who have major risk factors for disease. I would say it's not wise for them at this stage to go there. In the future, it will be. So I think it's just being a little extra cautious.
Makes sense. Another question about booster shots for variants and whether it will matter which vaccination you've had in terms of whether or not a booster is recommended.
Right. Well, someone, certainly if a virologist is sitting in the audience, he's probably waiting to pounce on me, because if I'm going to say, give a booster that's going to help the variant, it doesn't make too much sense from a virology point of view, because you're saying that the virus has changed. But we do believe that if you have, at least, and again, we need good data on this, but the assumption is that if you boost the immunity against the virus, and they have very much shared antigen, in other words, they share, it's the same virus, but slight differences. So if you give the same vaccine and you boost the antibodies, we would assume that it would give you a bit more protection. But at some stage, you would have to get a vaccine that actually includes the variant if it's made substantial change. The one in South Africa, for example, for the AstraZeneca, apparently it hasn't worked well. Well, it's a very small study, I might point out. So I'm not sure if it's really proven, but the AstraZeneca didn't do too well against the South African variant. The Pfizer and Moderna ones have done well, although they don't contain the South African variant. So that's why I'm saying it's a little bit more complicated. But I would say certainly, and we will probably be recommending a third dose. I would guess that we will be recommending to the population another dose of the vaccine, maybe in a year's time, whatever, or a new vaccine. By the way, just one comment, you can get, there's no contraindication to get another vaccine. In other words, if you've received one from Pfizer and you get one from AstraZeneca or Moderna and so on, there's no reason why not. There may be some issues here about slight differences in efficacy. There's no danger. There's no danger. It's perfectly safe.
Good to know. What are your thoughts of the newly approved Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and how is that potentially a game changer for inoculating the world?
Yeah, a good friend of mine led that study, Jerry Soda. So I have to be careful about being critical of the vaccine, but an excellent study and a good vaccine. It's another vaccine in the arsenal. One thing that a little puzzles me, but I guess people will correct me, is to say that Johnson & Johnson are very proud about giving only a single dose. But it seems to me that the single dose for Johnson & Johnson is not as good as the 2 doses for Pfizer and Moderna. So why not give 2 doses of Johnson & Johnson? So I think, the single dose, I don't know that that's a huge advantage. Maybe they may claim that it's giving more on a first dose. The one big advantage they have is the storage. It doesn't have to be stored at very low temperatures. So in fact, for developing countries and so on, it'll be very much the right vaccine. So it's certainly a very good addition to the vaccines.
So I'm looking here to see there are a few additional questions in the chat that really relate to the experience of Israelis with the lockdowns, with the restrictions. You've already spoken about the balance of risk and reward, but would love some of your observations on how that's really been working and the quarantines and the like, again, with an eye towards potentially reopening the country. I think that would be very interesting to folks on the line.
You know, I think that what's happening right now is that we're experiencing a situation which we can always say we should have prepared for better, and everywhere they can say that, and we didn't really. Although we've often prepared, and we generally prepare for pandemics and for bioterrorism and all kinds of dramatic events. But I think this kind of event was not really prepared for in the way that it should have been, and that's a lesson for the future. We need to make preparations because many of the decisions now, and I know some of my colleagues may be unhappy about me saying this, but many of the decisions now are not necessarily made on hard data or on evidence. We haven't really been able to develop the models that I think we should have to show basically the cost effectiveness. You know, what are we really gaining by the lockdowns, and what are we gaining and how much of them and so on. There's been a lot of intuitive kind of thinking. There's been a lot of data, and I'm not saying that they're not, you know, people are not good scientists and they're looking carefully at the data, but I still feel that we should have better tools, and this is something we need to develop to make more objective decisions as to what kind of lockdown. For example, what kind of price are we prepared to pay to keep the kids out of school for a year? I mean, that's a tremendous price basically for the children. And so what did we pay basically? You know, what was the benefit basically? And is society prepared to you know, where is society prepared to put their money basically, or their resources, or the businesses that have been affected? So this has been a tremendous experience, basically, a tremendous experiment for the world. And I think if I was to suggest to the people who are putting out money now for research, start putting money into planning for the next event and putting into place these kind of decision tools, because I think that they're not very well developed, or not sufficiently developed.
Can you speak a little bit about the quarantine rules and any possibility of relaxing those rules on people entering the country if they can show that they have been vaccinated, or if perhaps they're willing to quarantine at home instead of in one of the motels?
Well, the regulation now, as I hope, and it's being implemented in Israel, is that Israelis who've been vaccinated in Israel can return here and not go into quarantine. So they don't have to go into quarantine. Anyone who is not has to go into quarantine. They now have just introduced this new technology of the bracelet that you wear, which is basically a sensor and with a kind of it's a telephone, another kind of a cell phone, but it's not a real phone. It's a kind of cell phone and it actually gives us a central depot the information on where you are. So it actually can make sure or identify that you're at home or away. And that's just been introduced. Interestingly enough, that's already aroused the anger or whatever of the so-called, I'm not saying so-called, that's a bad term, of people who, many of whom I share their views, but of some people who are saying that this is an interference with civil rights, with privacy and so on and so forth, that you're putting on one of these things that you usually put on criminals and so on. I think that's a wrong interpretation. You know, we really are using tools that are to protect the health of the country. And if people want to interpret it wrongly, it would be wrong. It's just, I see it almost the same as if I give an injection to someone of an antibiotic, they'll say, well, that's just like people who self-inject with heroin. I mean, it's not the same thing. You know, we're talking about different ideas. So basically, I think I would be very happy to put that bracelet on. By the way, I don't feel it's an infringement on my privacy at all. But again, I'm not saying that it's, you know, the people don't have these different ideas, but there are.
Right.
So I think this is one of the issues. So I think we can deal with it. This is maybe one of the ways we'll deal much better with lockdowns. In other words, if we can make sure that people who have been exposed are in a way that's reasonable, are not circulating, this will help us a lot.
Definitely. And there were similar concerns raised with the monitoring of cell phones and tracking where people had been in an effort to try and control the spread, and obviously using technology as a way to help keep people safe is something that I think Israel has done a fabulous job of doing. And of course, you are correct. There will be critics, but it seems to be working and helping. And once again, Israel has been out there in front, serving as an example, as a role model, and as a light unto the nations. And we want to thank you so much for the expertise and guidance that you have been providing to the state of Israel as these tough decisions are made about how to keep people safe and how to conquer this virus. And we want to thank you for your time today and for all that you have contributed and continue to contribute to the state of Israel and to the world. Thank you so much.
Stay well and get vaccinated.
I am
Everybody.
So looking forward to it. Thank you. And now I would like to turn it over to close out this morning's session to my dear friend and colleague, co-chair of Israel and Global Jewish Citizenship, David Fine. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Lisa. As Lisa mentioned, my name is David Fine, and my claim to fame is that I'm Lisa's co-chair. I volunteered for this role for three main reasons. First, because I've had the good fortune to marry an Israeli over 30 years ago, and we've lived our life at the intersection of Jewish American and Israeli culture. So of course, IGJC is my natural home within CJP. Second, I was raised to believe that I have the privilege to be the next link in the Jewish story, and that it's my responsibility to play a tiny role towards ensuring the Jewish future. And third, I get to collaborate with Lisa, Gadi, Aviva, and Ariel, and a group of truly the most passionate and dedicated volunteers on the planet, working on cutting-edge programs that literally set the standard for what can be accomplished through people-to-people connections. I'd like to again thank today's speakers and special guests, Ariel Zwang from the JDC, Dr. Talzaks from Moderna, Deputy Counsel General Daniel Agranov, and of course, Dr. Manford Green. Dr. Green, you've reminded us why Israel is truly a light unto nations. Finally, please join us tomorrow when our keynote speaker will be Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, Chief Rabbi of the Jewish Council of the Emirates. It should be a fascinating talk, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.